Have you ever taken a photo, looked at it on the back of your camera and think, wow, that's a nice picture. But when you get home to editing, you realize that you missed focus, or there's a lot of, it's basically not sharp and it's blurry. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Paco. If it's your first time here, I'm a photographer based in Manila. And in this video, we'll be looking at 4 things to check to avoid taking blurry images. Now, the 4 things we want to check would be focus modes that we're using, the focus points we've got selected, what our aperture is in terms of how shallow our depth of field is, because that can affect it, and motion blur and or camera shake. So note that the terminology I use is Sony because I use Sony. It might vary depending on the camera brand that you're using, but these modes are generally available in all DSLR and mirrorless cameras. So we'll be starting off with focus modes. Now, there are 3. Now, the 3 most common focus modes are single shot AF, continuous AF, and automatic AF. Single shot AF is used for stationary subjects. It locks focus, you get that beep, and you take the shot. Continuous doesn't give you that beep, it's continuously tracking as long as you're half pressing or doing back button focus, as long as you've got your finger on focus, on the focus button. It'll continually keep focus on your subject, and it's used for moving subjects, as I don't know if I mentioned that. And automatic AF would be where the camera automatically decides whether you're using single or continuous AF. I find myself defaulting to continuous AF, mainly because I shoot with Sony and I use IAF. But even if I don't, I default to that because the focus is just the focusing system is just so good that whether or not there's motion, it locks focus. Now, if you're using an older DSLR, it might be a factor, but continuous AF, if your subject's stationary, great, it locks focus. If they move all of a sudden, it's okay because it's continuously trying to track. So I find continuous AF is what I default to. Automatic AF is something I find myself using never. Actually, I was gonna say the least, but I actually don't use it because I don't like the camera deciding whether to use single or continuous, and you're not sure whether it's on single or continuous, right? So no, I just use continuous AF and I'm good. Now, in terms of focus points or focus areas, the most common points or areas are wide, zone, center, and flexible spot. So wide is where it uses all the focus points and covers almost your entire frame. So wide uses all the focus points and the camera decides on what should be focused on. It's what I default to since I use IAF for portraits, and usually in my subjects in frame, there's nothing else in the background. It's great. But without IAF, you want to use this for moving subjects. So if you're not sure if your subject's moving closer to you, away from you, left or right, or in the frame, wide makes sure that your subject is in focus, but you want to usually use that with a narrower aperture. Zone is a second option I use, where you have to select where a frame or a zone is selected, and it's great if you have a busy frame with a lot of people for portraits, and I want to make sure that it's my subject, the person that I'm photographing, is that what's in frame and not the person behind. It's also great if you have a busy background, foreground, or if you're doing product photography where there's a lot of products and you want to focus on a certain area. That's what zone is great for. Center it says it there, it's the center of the frame. It's ideal for center compositions and also for taking photos that you want a lot of wiggle room for cropping in post. So that's where you'd want to use center. Flexible spot is also known as single point in other cameras, and I think aside from wide and zone, flexible spot is something I'd commonly use on a DSLR when I used to shoot Canon single point is what I'd use. With IAF, I don't use flexible spot as much, but if there are times that for whatever reason the autofocus isn't nailing it, the IAF isn't nailing it, I'd use flexible spot. And for portraits, you want to put that spot on the eye that is closest to the camera, to the frame, to the camera, to you. So there. Now, aperture, or shallow depth of field, we want to check what aperture we're using, because I know that getting the that shallow depth of field look is amazing, especially for portraits, but there are times, depending on the lens and body combination that you're using, that you can misfocus because we're shooting too wide open. Now, you want to stop down and use not the widest aperture, but stop down 1 or 2 stops. And there are a couple of reasons behind that. So shooting wide open doesn't give us the best image quality that the lens can give. And this is a lot more evident with the more affordable lenses. So stopping down would benefit us, it'll give us a sharper image, it'll improve the sharpness of the image. Also, it will lessen any chromatic aberration present. It'll clear up any vignetting, and it also reduces barrel distortion or pincushion distortion. We're getting a lot of wind. There we go. Next up is motion blur and camera shake. Now, motion blur occurs when the subject is moving too fast. And I think we're going to get a bit of rain soon. Motion blur occurs when your subject is moving too fast based on the shutter speed that you're using. So if you get motion blur in a shot, you want to use a slightly faster shutter speed, or a way faster shutter speed, depending on how fast your subject is moving. Camera shake, on the other hand, is movement of the camera due to unsteady hands. And you'll notice that the longer the focal length that you use, the more obvious camera shake becomes. The general guide to camera shake is the reciprocal rule, where we use the inverse of our focal length as our minimum shutter speed. So if we're using a 50mm lens, we do not want to use anything slower than 1/50 for the shutter speed to eliminate camera shake. But this is a general guideline when shooting handheld, and it depends on the lens that you're using, so you have to keep in mind what lens you're using. Also, if you have a crop factor on your sensor, so if you're using an APS-C, that 1/50 automatically becomes 1/100. Also, if you have camera stabilization available, you might be even to use slower shutter speeds. So those are factors to consider. Now, me, I have shaky hands. I generally double that. I use double the shutter speed required, or double the shutter speed of the reciprocal rule, just to make sure, because I've got shaky hands. So I don't use 1/50 when I'm on a 50mm lens. I use at least 1/100. So there. Now, if you're starting out in photography and you're looking for answers, you may want to check out this playlist over here. It contains a lot of info for beginners, and I make it as thorough as I can. And if you want to see some of the shoots I've done, some of the behind the scenes, you can click this up here. And if you found my videos helpful, or this video helpful, or generally just like what I'm talking about, leave a like and do consider subscribing. And I thank you if you do. So hopefully what we talked about today helps you in getting sharp photos, or at least increases your hit to miss ratio. You get more keepers than bad shots. But remember that your photos don't always have to be tack sharp. Motion blur sometimes adds character to the image and can help make a better composition when used appropriately. So yeah, there you go. Hopefully this helps, and I'll see you in the next video.